Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Switch Meter Reading Exceptions Changes to Support MHHS webinar. My name is Amy. I work on the communications team for the RECCo manager, and I'll be facilitating today's session. I have joining me today John and Sarah from RECCo and Harriet from the RECChange team. So just a few bits of housekeeping to kick us off today. This session is being recorded, and the recording and slides for this event will be made available on the RECC portal next week. If everyone could please keep their microphones and cameras off and less speaking, it would be greatly appreciated. To take your questions today, we're using Slido, and you can access this via the QR code that's currently on the screen. If you have a smartphone, you can use your camera app to scan the QR code, or alternatively, you can access Slido by typing in slido.com into your web browser and typing in the number on the screen. We will have a designated Q&A section, but please feel free to raise your questions as they come to you throughout the session. So I will now pass over to Sarah to take us through the agenda for today. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, thanks. So just to reiterate what Amy was saying, really, we're keen that this is quite an interactive session to talk through the meter read exception process. So feel free to just raise hands and ask questions as we go through, but Slido's there as a backup. So on the agenda today, we want to just give a bit of a background in terms of the design, the MHHS design, and the work that's been going on through the MHHS programme, and then move across to talk about the impacts on that in terms of the switch meter read process that we've got documented currently within the RECC. So John and I will just take us through the processes that the MHH programme are developing, and the processes that we've got currently in the RECC, and then we can talk through what changes we think might be needed across the board. So just going through to the next slide, just a quick slide on the purpose of the session. So really keen to focus this session on the consequential changes to the RECC. We shared the slides beforehand, and there's a link on this slide here to the transfer of read process that the MHHS design have been developing, and that's now been baselined and is available to look at. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat. Hopefully someone can put the Slido code onto the chat, if that's okay. So yeah, so we're focusing here on the consequential changes to the RECC. I guess as we walk through the process, there may be some comments and questions on the MHHS design itself. Happy to have conversations about those, especially where they link to the processes that we're talking about under the RECC. But I think we just wanted to set out the kind of scope of this session. Really is focused on the RECC consequential impacts and any sort of concerns, issues, questions around the actual design of the MHHS will need to go through to the MHHS team through the programme discussions. But we'll take that as we go through and see if there's any specific concerns that come out the back of considering the retail arrangements. So if we move on to the next slide. So we want to give just a bit of background on the MHHS design for those of you that aren't too close to the MHHS work that's been progressed through the programme. So the next slide just really summarises at a very high level the changes that are being made to the settlement arrangements through the MHHS work. So the key part is obviously the BSC changes around the new requirements for settlement. So the introduction of the new BSC central systems to manage the profiling and volume allocation work. And that's not something that touches on the RECC particularly at all. But then when we go down to the lower level detail, the programme is introducing new actors. So the new advanced and the smart data services, which will replace the existing references and roles for the half-hourly and non-half-hourly data collectors, and the data aggregator role will also disappear once the MHHS new arrangements are fully in place. And that in itself will have knock-on effects into the RECC. The other new role that the MHHS programs talks about is the new advanced and smart metering services. From a RECC perspective, we're working on the basis that is basically a sort of MHHS term for the MEM role. So whilst we'll reflect those new processes within the RECC, there's no sort of specific new role being created there. It's a change to the processes that the existing MEMs deliver already. In terms of the approach to delivering the design, there is another slide which we'll come to in a minute in terms of the new business processes, but basically the design is made up of a number of new business processes that support settlements and deliver the way that set out the way that data is shared. And there's references throughout to the sharing of meter reading data, consumption data and meter technical details, and that's really where the knock-on impacts onto the RECC are coming through. So specifically around the meter read data that's needed and required for settlements, which is really core to the MHHS design, but then the knock-on impacts in terms of the data that's required for billing and retail processes, which is obviously really important from a RECC perspective. And then, as I say, the meter technical details not the subject of this workshop, but obviously a key one for the RECC and the activities that the MEM delivers around meter operations. And then the final bullet there around the introduction of a new data integration platform, so the DIP service, which has been introduced to support the exchange of market messages between market participants and central systems. So there are still processes that will require the existing DTM flows. The switch meter read process that we're talking about today still retains the D300. But in addition, there are new interfaces being developed for sharing data between market participants. So in terms of the design, it was baselined on the 31st of October, so there is now a sort of core design baseline to work from, which is sort of the why we're kicking off now the considerations of what the knock-on effects are on the RECC. There is a list of work-off items, so there's a work-off plan that's being delivered and expected to go through to the end of January. So there's still some question marks over some of the MHHS design, but the basic processes are now agreed and baselined. So I've just got one more slide on the design, and just really again for those of you that are not too familiar with the different design artifacts, what the MHHS programme has set out are a number of different design artifacts. There's approximately 70 at this stage, and what they look like. The key ones, there's a number of new business processes. So there's end-to-end business process diagrams and description spreadsheets that explain those end-to-end processes. So there's ones around agent appointments, and the one that we've been particularly talking about here is around the transfer reads that we'll walk through. In addition to that, there's some business requirement documents. So for each of the key actors, there's a list of requirements that those actors need to deliver. A lot of those are duplicates of what's in the business process diagrams, and then there's some additional generic ones, and those requirements will be set out either in the BSE, the RECC, or potentially other codes. The second CUSA will pick up some of those requirements as well. There are some method statements, so where there's some specific activities that the different actors have to deliver. Then there's some more detailed kind of method statements that will be taken into drafting. I think generally they come under the BSE remit, so not necessarily something that is core to the RECCo drafting. And then there's some requirements relating to the new DIP service, and obviously interface catalogues around the new interfaces. So I guess we just wanted to give a bit of background there to set the scene, because no, not everybody's close to the MHHS design as it's been developing. I guess what we're trying to demonstrate here as well, it's not an easy lift and shift of the MHHS design to say here's the impacts that we need to make under the RECCo. And the area that we wanted to talk about today, the switch meter readings, it's really one of those areas where there are knock-on impacts on the RECCo, but those haven't been defined by the MHHS programme. So we want to take the information that we've got that comes from the different artefacts and sort of work through that and just understand how we see the process working following the transfer over to the MHHS arrangements. Did someone wanted to say something there? No, sorry, I thought I heard a question. Okay, so we're going to move on to start talking through the transfer of reads process. So just before we do that, did anyone have any specific questions? I don't know if anything's come up in Slido.
We've not received anything through yet, so I think we're good to continue, unless anyone has anything they'd like to raise now.
No. Okay, great. John, I think, are you okay walking through the transfer process?
Yep, no problem. So really continue with the theme of setting the scene on this. I was just going to give a very high level overview of what the design what the MHHS design is proposing to move to in terms of how the transfer of reads will work, and that really sets the scene for how we need to manage exceptions in the RECCo if there's a need to chase or to challenge what's been received. So next slide, please. So the transfer of reads process is captured in the business process 3C. So if you're looking for that, that's available on the MHHS website or their collaboration space. And that's the process map, and it also has a business process description that sets out what each of those steps are intended to mean. And it talks about it in the context of a change of data service, but in the case of a change of supply, that would essentially result in a change of data service, that process would become what is the COS reading. And the process sets it out separately for smart meters, traditional meters, and advanced meters. So the way in which that exchange of data is managed depends on the type of metering and the market segment that the MPAN operates in. It includes the ability for suppliers to dispute the transfer reading using the D300 process if that's required, but how we apply that process in the RECCo has been left for us to define as a consequential change. Next slide, please. So for the smart meter process, like I said, this is at a very high level, and there is a supporting process map in the MHHS design. But the very basic concept of this is that suppliers and data service will attempt to recover readings from the device, so both the losing and the gaining suppliers and their services in this case. And they will then use that, and the old data service, so where the previous supplier or the previous data service is able to receive a reading, they will send the cumulative register reading for the meter to the new data service and to both the old and the new supplier via the new DIP interface, interface 41. The cumulative register, for those who aren't familiar with the term, represents the total register of a meter that has time of use registers. So if it's a traditional meter with a single register, then that will just be the only register, and if it's a time of use traditional meter or if it's a smart meter which has 48 time of use register tariffs, there will be a cumulative register that has the total consumption recorded for that meter at any one point in time. Where the old data service can't get the readings, they will estimate the cumulative reading and send an estimate to everyone via the DIP interface. Harshada, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just a question. You mentioned about the cumulative read about the one register. What if there are multiple register reads? How do we separate those two?
Yep, so if there are time of use registers on the meter, either because it's a traditional meter with time of use registers or a smart meter which all have time of use registers, then there will be a separate cumulative register that will be available for the meter.
Okay, so if there are two registers, day rate and night rate, there will be two cumulative reads?
There will be a single cumulative read of the combination of the day and the night.
Okay, but if you do want the individual reads for billing purpose, how do we obtain that?
We'll come on to billing purposes in a bit. This is very much just about how the reading is shared between data services under the new process for settlement. Okay. But the new process focuses on having a single cumulative meter reading recorded for settlement purposes where the meter isn't recording half-hourly consumption. Richard.
Yeah, just to clarify on the traditional meter then, that has more than one settlement register. Let's say, for example, the economy 7, we get the day and the night, and there isn't actually a total cumulative read on the meter. It's up to the data service then to calculate the cumulative read for that.
Yes, there will need to be a calculation of what the cumulative reading is, because you do have some traditional meters that don't have a cumulative register associated with them. So on that basis, I expect the onus would be on the supplier and or the data service to have a mechanism of calculating that.
And is there a defined method of calculation when you have to, in effect, create a register reading for a register that doesn't exist on the meter?
I don't believe there is. If there was, it would be in the data service method statement, but I don't believe there is. But that's something that would be subject to the MHHS design. But I don't believe they have done that. No.
Okay.
Okay, and if we move on, so that's the overview of how the smart meter service will work. For traditional meters, so a supplier may get their own customer readings from this and share it with each other. So what would happen normally is that the gaining supplier would attempt to receive a customer own reading and share that with its data service, and that would then be shared. That would be shared via a D10. So the traditional route between the data services and the old data service would then use would either estimate the reading on receipt of that or estimate it in the event they didn't receive that and send the estimated read to the new data service via the D10. So fairly similar process to what we're used to with the traditional readings. That will be shared through the D10 route. If we move on finally for advanced meters, so advanced meters don't agree a cumulative reading between them on COS. So both the old and the new data services will attempt to access the data from the meter, and where they can't access that data, the old data service will estimate the consumption data, and the new data service will request what's called a consumption replay from the DIP via interface 15 and receive the response via interface 16, and they'll essentially get the settlement period level data they need to understand previous consumption patterns and to begin settling on new consumption patterns going forward. So that's the context of what the new processes are proposing, and what we need to cover in a little while is basically, on the basis of those three processes, which of those need to be continue to be subject to a missing and a disputed meter reading process. How is that different to today? And then what do we need to do or to consider to enact the right solution for that? So if before we move on, are there any final questions on the kind of high level view of what the programme are proposing for how these reads will be exchanged? Rashada.
Yeah, when you say old data service, is it something to do with the DTN, which we use as D10?
No, the data service. The data service refers to the new smart data service or advanced data service roles that the programme have introduced. So they kind of replace the data collector agent role that exists today. So that's the supplier appointed agent that validates and processes settlement data for their MPANs for them.
So is it the old data services also the existing smart data service?
It's the existing smart or advanced data service for the losing supplier, yes. Okay, if we move on, the next bit I was going to cover, which again is just for scene setting and considering this, is Rashada touched on the use of register readings for billing separately. So the MHHS processes focus on what's needed for settlement. It either agrees a meter reading for a smart or traditional meter, a cumulative meter reading. That means that the old supplier is liable for the appropriate level of consumption up to the day of the switch, and the new supplier is liable for consumption from the date of that switch. And that's the purposes of the agreed reading that's transferred between data services. But in the new world, as that's only ever going to be a single cumulative meter reading, it may not be reflective of the register readings that the suppliers are using for billing purposes. So in the example given earlier of Economy 7, there may be a total register that's used for the transfer reading, which is a single meter reading, but the one or both of the suppliers involved in the switch may be billing the customer on a day and night register, which have different meter readings to that which is exchanged. So I think one of the things we need to consider in the REC is that fine? Is there a mechanism already for suppliers to manage that? And that process should be fully restricted to the use of the agreed reading for settlement purposes, or do we also need to consider if there does need to be a transfer of meter readings for billing purposes in certain cases? So if we move on to the next slide, I think I might have already started talking to this one. So yes, I think this is the one I've just been talking through. So what we want to consider here as we go through the exceptions process is the two parts. One is, how do we need to make this work for the agreement of the settlement reading, and then is there an additional consideration of scenarios where billing readings may need to be shared between suppliers. And we want to be careful when we look at this that we don't create an onerous process for the sake of it, and that may not always be needed, but we also want to make sure that we don't disadvantage consumers in particular scenarios where this may genuinely be needed. So if we move to the next slide, I've just put a very basic example on the screen. So if you imagine a scenario where supplier one, the old supplier, has a smart meter and they're billing the customer on an Economy 7 tariff, and at the time of the switch, the day register has a reading of 1000 and the night register has a reading of 500. And if you assume no other registers have ever been active for that smart meter, then the cumulative register would be 1500 for that. So the reading that would be used by the data service and settlement would be a reading of 1500. But the two readings used by supplier one to close off the billing would be a day reading of 1000 and a night reading of 500. Now, supplier two might not be choosing to offer that economy 7 tariff. They might be bringing the customer in on a single rate tariff, and they may be choosing to bill that on the cumulative reading because they feel it's simpler for them to align that with the reading they're given to their data service. But there would also be no restriction from them using register 1, which would be a reading of 1000 for that. So that the transfer reading in this case that would go between the data services and the suppliers would be 1500. And supplier 1 would need to know to close off their billing to a reading of 1500 separately. And supplier 2 would need to know to start off their billing on that cumulative register of 1500 if that's what they chose to do. So in this case, if that reading of 1500 was agreed, I think there was an assumption made in the programme that the old supplier would be able to either retrieve those register readings, or if they couldn't retrieve those, would be able to reasonably estimate those register readings to close off their customers' billing where they've got an agreed cumulative reading. And that there is a similar process in place for the new supplier to receive that reading in some capacity. I suppose the question for billing purposes here falls a lot on the new supplier. If the new supplier cannot obtain meter readings either through the customer or remotely for any reason, then there's a bit of a question here of how do they know which registers are active on the meter and what those registers are so they can bill the customer appropriately. Paul, you've got your hand up.
I had a quick question about what's on the slide, and then the other bit you may be going on to, John. In the example there where you've got some moving to a single rate tariff and the billing rate to be 1500, I'm not sure that would be true. It would be whichever register is configured, and it's more likely to be 1000, I think, because you wouldn't bill from you set up a single rate tariff on one of the tariff registers. So you should have a map. One would hope at least one of the tariff registers would map between those two tariffs somewhere.
Yeah, my point earlier is that's down to the supplier. So I think I did mention that's a choice the supplier can make. They could choose to use register 1, for instance, time use register 1, which in this case would be 1000. Or they could choose to use the cumulative register for billing purposes if they felt that was simpler and made things easier. They would write, as you say, they would have to configure register 1 if they wanted to configure that on the smart meter, but they also wouldn't necessarily have to do that. They could just leave a configuration on the smart meter, set the kind of tariff rates appropriately, and choose to use cumulative reading for billing if that was their preferred option. I think that the main thing they'd have to worry about is making sure that the tariff was reflected on the in-home display correctly.
Yeah, that was where my main thought was coming from. So that's where you're most likely. But yeah, as you say, it's up to the suppliers to choose. The other question around this, I guess one of the things. So in this, you're looking at the two suppliers taking their own readings effectively for billing purposes, or I guess a third party taking those on their behalf. I guess one of the questions there is about the timing of that and when those two events occur, and whether that's in the design as well, because if you're not taking the readings at the same time, you're always going to, those two things are not, the supply 1, supply 2 readings, I guess, are always likely to be slightly different.
Yes, quite possibly. If for instance, the losing supplier programmed to take their reading at 11 p.m. the day before the switch, for instance, and the new supplier programmed to take it at midnight or soon after, then there would be some differential. Or if the new supplier attempted and had a configuration issue and couldn't get the reading until day +1, day +2, then there would be a divergence between the readings that they obtained. Yes.
Okay, so but the assumption is that the old data service, new data service, I guess, are getting those cumulative readings at midnight.
That's the idea. That's the happy path. Yes.
Yeah, and I know from my time spent smart metering that I think that the meter stores some data information at midnight that you can then access retrospectively. So if you can't get it at midnight, in theory, it might be on the meter. So could I guess the supplier could then could they ask their data service to take those readings at the same time as they're getting that midnight reading, or from that same snapshot? Because the key thing I'm thinking about is how you get these things to make sure they line up, because the current process, I think you mentioned, has got two things. The old new supplier built to the same readings, and billing and settlements always align, and just want to work out how you ensure that happens through this model as well. Most importantly, that we don't contravene one of the principles in the RECCo, which is that customers don't get billed for energy twice. And that's small gaps, I think, is also a concern, but anything that could accidentally cause those readings to overlap would be a significant concern.
Yep, absolutely, and we want to avoid that as we look through the solutions. Absolutely.
Just a quick one on that. So the incoming data service does share the reads that they take with everybody, though, don't they? They share that with the new and the outgoing supplier, so everybody can see the read that is being taken by the incoming data service, even if they've recovered their own reads. So there is that opportunity for the suppliers to reconcile.
Yes, they publish that cumulative reading, and so looking at the map, they make that cumulative reading available just to the new supplier. And it's the old supplier's reading that's made available to everyone.
Yeah, sorry, the old data service.
Yes.
Sorry, but what there is one data service that sends its reads around to everybody. So yeah, you're right. It's the outgoing data service sends its reads to everybody, so everybody sees what the old data service has, including the new supplier.
Yeah. Richard, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Is this example cover for traditional meter as well then?
Essentially, it's probably less likely that a traditional meter you would change the way in which you bill them, the registers in which you bill them on a switch, because traditionally, I believe, if suppliers wanted to offer a kind of single unit rate across 24 hours of the day for a multi-rate meter, they would simply apply the same unit rate to all of the active registers. So I think it's less of a concern. It's less of a concern here, but the on traditional meters, the supplier would receive a D10 with the register readings as well. So if this were a traditional scenario, then you would receive traditional meter technical details. So you would receive a D150 and a D149 as you do today, which would include register mapping. And then you would receive a D10 with readings for each of those registers.
And where would that D10 come from?
That D10 would come from that D10 would come from the data services.
As part of a cyclical read process, are you talking about the D10 coming from as part of the change of supply process?
It would come as part of the change of supply process.
Right. So what we've got here then is on the billing swim lane, we've got supplier 1 just sending the cumulative reading to supplier 2 from a billing perspective. But if supplier 2 is there's the expectation that supplier 2 will use the supplier 2 is going to use that cumulative then as for settlements. But for actually being able to use as a starting point for the customer on the bills, the supplier would ultimately use what comes through in the D10 that's going to have the day and the night registers on.
I think the data service would just use the readings on the D10 to determine what goes into settlement on this one. So if this, I think this is less of a concern for traditional, because I believe the D10 will go around in a similar manner to as it does today, and it will be down to the data service to validate and transform that data in some capacity.
So I guess again, the data service is going to be using the load shape profile out there for the settlement rather than the readings in the half hourly world. It was just trying to picture, you know, from what the new supplier starts from as the kind of like gain read for billing, and also what the customer sees on the meter, just so that the customer has a viable way to validate the accuracy of the bills by looking at what's on the bill as to what's on the meter.
Yeah.
So that the customer won't see this kind of like logical cumulative reading that is being passed around from old to new suppliers and the data services. But there's still got to be a way for the supplier to show on the bill what the customer would see on the meter.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
and I think yeah, it's a good point. I think the this scenario is very much probably restricted to smart on the basis that that you would have that register read information being transferred among the relevant participants on the D10 for the traditional meter.
Yeah, okay. I was just trying to get my head around this example, you know, when I think as you said, there are some slight differences between what would happen, you know, for a smart meter versus a traditional meter.
Yes, definitely. Harshada.
Yeah, just one more question. So let's consider if there is no switch. You currently have a traditional meter on the wall, even after MHHS program goes live. But we have the agent role changing as mob DADC is now replaced by a new role. Is that the same? The new role agent is now going to read the meter and provide the read to the supplier as normal, or the trad meters which is still on the wall?
Yes, so there will be a meter reading service as you have today. So the supplier contracts with a meter reading service today, and the data collector kind of agrees a schedule with that meter reading service on behalf of the supplier, and they pass the data back to the data collector. That process will happen with traditional meters in the enduring world, in the new world as well. So they're actually calling it the meter reading service rather than the non-half hourly data retriever, but the role will exist very much in the same way it does today.
And this is only even after the MHHS program goes live, that role will still be doing the same thing.
Yes. So it will still be a service procured by suppliers and you know those you know the nature of the service provided to suppliers depends very much on the supplier's requirements and what the service provider offers with that.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so hopefully that's got some thinking going and set the scene for what we're looking to cover. I think certainly one of the things here that's come out of this for me is that, you know, the example we've got on the screen, I think is quite discrete to the smart meter, the smart meter journey that exists, and that there's probably different considerations for advanced and traditional and smart as we go through this, and it's worth taking them in the round. And I think that's probably a good point to move on for Sarah to take you through the thoughts on the impacts of the exceptions process.
Yeah, thanks. Can we move on to the next slide? Oh, it was probably more on the earlier slides. One of the questions we had, we'll stay with where we are for the slides, but I think it's just really picking up where John was talking about the basic point is that that settlements is requiring focusing on the cumulative register read. So from a settlement perspective, the MHHS processes are based around agreement of that cumulative read and sharing of that cumulative read. I think the first question that we wanted to kind of understand really before we get into actually the exceptions process itself is really, is there a need to for suppliers to agree the lower level meter register reads, or is the sort of regulated process the process that needs to be within the code itself? Can it just focus on the agreement of the cumulative read? Because I think once we understand that, then it kind of flows through some of the sort of the other questions that we've got around the scope and the triggers. So it'd be really helpful if people have got any thoughts on it. It's linked to what we were just talking about, but it's a bit more of a specific question. Like the RECCo refers to a switch meter read, and then there's a process for disputing that read. I think where we've been talking about this previously, we keep coming back to the conclusion that if the two suppliers can agree the cumulative register read, then each supplier will know what the energy is that they need to bill for. Picking up Paul's point, that will avoid any duplicate billing, and obviously we can talk about how far apart the agreement needs to be before you trigger this process, but you'd know how much energy you were billing for on each under each of the supplier's responsibilities. I guess to put the question a different way, can people see an argument for the disputed reads process, the switch meter reads exceptions process applying to register reads? Or would you be comfortable if the focus of this is on the cumulative reads, and actually anything at the lower level is sort of dealt with within the supplier's own remit for billing? Has anyone got any thoughts on that? Paul, brilliant.
Break this up. I think try to get my head around. So I think it's how those work where you've got customer initiated disputes, because the only bit they're exposed to is the register reads. And so I just try to think it through from that kind of the process of where you get at the customer initiated because they don't think it's reflective of the reading is accurate. Would that, if you only got the cumulative reads in the RECCo area, would that mean effectively that's the suppliers would agree the change in the cumulative, and then they would individually need to work out what that meant in terms of adjusting their billing on both sides of that? Because does that not create a risk that then you end up, if it's on a multi-rate tariff, that you don't agree the same start and stop? If you're changing it from to something else, we need to line up at a register billing level, because I can see how that could be confusing for customers if the two suppliers take the same cumulative reading and apportion that differently across the registers and lead to a mismatch, and that I'm not sure that'd be the right outcome for the customer. So it feels like there needs to be something in there that says, we might need to agree that at a granular register level in order to meet the customer's expectations about and ensure they're billed accurately at a register level as well.
And do you see that as being an actual agreement of those register readings, or is there a difference between needing to agree the cumulative bilaterally between suppliers versus having visibility of the registers to give the supplier the information it needs in order to support billing? I don't know if they're two different things, but it feels like they might be.
I guess we mandate it's going through that process, how that, just trying to think it through in terms of, you know, agreeing, you know, this is where we agree that how the energy should be allocated, what that cumulative is. I'm going to put this onto a final, how that translates into one we put on the final bill, and the initial bill seems like that's what the customer's expecting, a change to what's happening in their bill, and how we ensure that meets, if the customer initiated dispute, how they're going to see that and understand that, because it feels like there's a risk that could look like two different things from the two suppliers if they haven't agreed at the register level what, you know, the outcome of that dispute is. If you look at multi-register meters,
it could, you know, look like two different things. I think there's probably a question on, you know, if that's necessarily the wrong thing, isn't it? Because I think if we assume we're talking about smart meters for a moment, then, you know, we have an existing process today whereby the new supplier and the old supplier can configure completely different tariffs, and that could still be two registers, but just configured at different times of day and all of that. Or it could be, you know, I mean, you know, it could be one configures 2, one configures 4, you know, all of that stuff. And so where this is the case, if you have the kind of you start billing a customer on a reading of, on a 2 register reading of 1,500, and you've agreed a cumulative reading of 1,500 with the previous supplier. If the supplier, if the customer then comes in and says, well, this isn't right, the day should be 1,200 and the night should be 300, then I think that's the point of, if the total consumption is the same or not materially different to warrant a dispute, then do you need to agree with the previous supplier to resolve that query from the customer, or is that within the supplier's gift to say, well, actually, if I've got sufficient evidence to back up what the customer is saying and it doesn't materially affect my position in settlement, then I can simply resolve that customer query myself without needing to have the customer on hold while I agree something separately with the supplier.
I guess it's thinking through how that, I think something like the design might mean for later reads, and I guess the continuity. So what would cause you, I mean, presumably the most likely reason for raising a dispute is because it was an inaccurate estimate rather than, I would hope, an accurate actual, if we're talking about smart meters in that case, John.
I think just to support you, Paul, sorry, just jumping in. I think, you know, the issue that I see is with the traditional meters, you know, we've got time of use, 1, 2 or more registers on a traditional meter, is that if I was a customer, I'd be wanting to see what I was billed up to from my old supplier, and making sure that those readings were my starting point from a new supplier. And if there's any discrepancy, you know, between those register readings that I see on my bill, then I'll be phoning up the supplier in all instances, the new supplier, you know, to say, look, your readings don't correspond to the previous supplier's readings.
Yeah, and I think that's I think that is a valid use case. If there was a material difference in that scenario for traditional meters, then there may well be a need to agree something, because you are, you know, traditional meters, it does have a direct impact on the billing.
Yeah,
I think so. I think there is a separate thing for traditional and there is a separate thing for smart. And I think Sarah's question probably applies more to the smart world, where ultimately, you know, if you're both bidding for the same amount of consumption and you've both got the same settlement liability and you're both bidding the consumer accurately, do you need to agree on how you do it and the exact mechanism of that, I suppose, is the point. So, you know, that scenario that I gave there for a smart meter, I think, you know, there is a valid one there where, you know, if things are materially different and it does have an impact on both periods, then that's where there may be a case for it. But I'm thinking in the bulk of periods, if they call up because there's an inaccurate estimate, then that would also come down to materiality point, because if I use the 1,500 scenario again, if it turns out that they believe that that reading should have been 1,200 and 800, then there would be a 500 kilowatt hour difference in the energy consumption, and if that was deemed to be material, that would require a dispute to the cumulative reading, wouldn't it? And so I just think, you know, when you kind of work some of this stuff through on the smart side of things, if you agree what the transfer reading should be, and you've got information to justify what you believe you should start billing the customer from and to based on your tariff, do you need to, for that type of customer, agree what those time of use register readings are between them? So do we need a regulated process that says you have to agree these are the exact readings you use? Or do we have to have a way to make sure that the information is available to allow you to make that determination yourself, and that the cumulative reading is what's agreed in that scenario?
To just at the very least, I think the old supplier's probably got the best view of how that gets allocated across registers should at least share that with the new supplier, because I think in your example, if all you agree is the 1,500, the old supplier closes to 1,500 and the new supplier opens to 1,100 and 400, that could have an impact on the way that customer gets billed. So if it allocates more, the next day take a reading, more units onto the higher rates potentially. So whether you mandate it, but at least say, well, this is, you know, we've agreed this and these are the registers I've done, it would seem to help mitigate the risk. Whether you would oblige your new supplier to use that data, but at least if it's available, they can use it in a decision-making process. If they're using the same registers, they can then, I guess, use work from that basis. But yeah, I can't see the harm in that personally. But
we've already got the smart change supply process. It seems to be working, doesn't it? With that transfer of data and all the 49 register readings. So everybody's got full visibility rather than just the one cumulative.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say the process that's set out under the MHHS process does have that the old suppliers send in the D10 to the new supplier for that reason. That's how I see it anyway, is to allow that reconciliation. So does that cover your point, Paul? That gives you the visibility of the registers as well as the cumulative read that comes from the data service.
As part of the standard process, yes, I think what we're talking about here then is if you're looking at a dispute, or even agreeing if you're missing read. I'm not sure in the new design how if it's as likely, because I think a lot of the reasons for missing switch reads yes at the moment, which is largely failures in the transfer of data, is going to hopefully you won't see as I'm really hoping you won't see as many missing switch reads, otherwise you've missed a huge opportunity. But I think it's that dispute process and what you're going to get in that the most likely reason for a dispute, unless everybody has cocked up reading the meter, or the two suppliers, I guess it's or two suppliers have read it at totally different times, there's disconnect, it's the estimate, in which case that data is going to be slightly different, and what the trigger is an inaccurate estimate that then causes the customer to go, that's not the right output. And yeah, in the standard process you'd get all of that. The leasing supplier can make all of that. I think Richard mentioned the current process, you make the whole 49 registers available and you can pick out of it what you want. From that disputes process, I think what we say is, you don't just what you agree between the two suppliers is not just that transfer point, the bit that goes back into settlement. I assume at some point that says this is the new cumulative reading for settlement, but this is also, as the leading supplier, how I'm going to bill the customer. Having agreed, I'm going to close my bill to 1,500. This is how I'm going to split it, because the new supplier, if the reason you've estimated is because a comms problem, would probably want to start from the same point. And so making that information available as part of the disputes process, saying this is what I'm going to bill to, the new supplier can make a choice whether, I don't know if you go back to that point, mandate you must use that same, but you mustn't, but it's good information. I was just the new supplier could then make a decision. Yeah, I can start from the, as you say, I can start from the same point. Otherwise, I'm not sure how that new supplier is going to take that 1,500, if that's what's been agreed, and turn that into something.
So I'm just trying to make sure I understand what you're saying, Paul. So the standard process will be that you, as the game supplier, you'll get the cumulative read and you'll get the D10. And I think we were sort of suggesting that you could dispute the cumulative read if it was materially different to the expectation, like the customer disputed, for example. And I think we were suggesting that you wouldn't need to dispute the meter register reading if you had visibility of the sort of D10 information. But I guess that then takes us into, rather than the disputed read, it's the missing read. If you didn't get the D10 and you needed it, so the dispute was about the register read information, and you needed that, but you hadn't got the D10 as part of the standard process, then that's the other sort of trigger for the D300 exception process being needed. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think so, but that is also a very good point around. I think, yeah, like exception.
If you get the D10 as part of the standard process, why would you need it in the disputed read process?
I think, but you would only get. Do you get that D10 only if you've got an actual reading, not if, or is that always at a register, generator register level? So I think it's how, if you've got the register read, if the fundamental problem is that the reading is wrong, and that's most likely to come from it being estimated, all of that data is going to be inaccurate and therefore could be up for, I guess, being amended as a consequence.
Yeah, I guess my expectation, and this may be not clearly understood the MHHS process, but my understanding was that the supplier would have to, if there was an estimate, the supplier would have to estimate the register reads to provide the D10. So they'd get the estimated cumulative from the data service, and then the supplier would need to estimate the register reads.
I think that's my understanding as well, Sarah. And then they would send that to the new supplier to say this is effectively in the way that we do. I think it's in the nosy flow, the number of which escapes me now. I think that's this is what I think that the COS reading was based on that cumulative and doing that estimation. So if then what you agree, and that, you know, if that cumulative was estimated, if what then gets disputed amends the cumulative and therefore those estimated readings on that D10, that should presumably form part of the disputed reads process. I think that's I'm pretty sure that was the that's what we're going back to, is I don't think you can separate. I think you just do the cumulative and leave the rest to suppliers. I think I can't see how that would be result in the right outcomes for consumers, because I can see that create confusion and potentially, not overall in terms of energy, but at a register level, getting charged for at the wrong rates or being charged for something twice, because actually on the day register, on the night or the night register, my reading, it's now gone from 500 to 400, because that's how the new suppliers, and that's where I think you need to understand it at a register level in those. But hopefully, you know, the more accurate reads are getting, hopefully this is in those limited occasions where you've got an estimate and can't get it, and there that estimate is inaccurate. But I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to know, obviously, this far out how likely that is to arise, I think.
Just to kind of understand if there's like an order of precedent type thing, are we saying that that you should only raise a dispute if you're disputing the cumulative, but in resolution of that dispute, you would include the D10, any update to the D10 within that, rather than just you can dispute the register read? Because I think that comes back to the point, if you're comfortable with the cumulative, then is there any need to dispute the register read?
I think if you're not changing that, it's just I guess those are the kind of things that you wouldn't. What you're not changing it from a settlements point of view. Is that how would that arise? Is it in that process, and that's the estimation, and maybe that's one you would would just be between suppliers. I think I guess that comes back to the thresholds and the framework for what is a dispute, because the current thresholds are about changing the overall, and that comes back to the point that all of the reads are the same for settlement, the same for billing. You're now saying, well, do I do something different? I don't need to change settlement, but maybe I need to readjust it for billing purposes. And I think I'm trying to think how that would arise. Again, possibly in the case of an estimate, so that's the right number of units, it's just totally misallocated. I've got the day and the night the wrong way round, and the customer isn't happy with that, because they read the meter and work out that it was wrong. You're going to have to go back to.
I think that's, again, Paul, just going back to the traditional meter perspective. The customers are going to want to see the same readings that have been billed up to from the old supplier, and the same readings used by the new supplier on a traditional meter. And I think the settlements with the cumulative is kind of like secondary. I think most of the disputes would come from customers where they don't have that continuous readings over the change of supply scenario.
And I think the point that comes to Richard is, and every smart meter that isn't communicating on cause is effectively a traditional meter from that perspective. Yeah. And then I think it's still a customer expectation, unless we match up with customers as part of the transition. And I think the other part of this is how these processes change in terms of managing customer expectations as well. These things are going to be different, but don't worry, because otherwise what we're going to get is loads of people disputing their bills because they don't understand it, not because they're wrong. And that's one for not for today, for everyone fish by 3, but there's also what do we need to change in the RECC, and then how do we need to manage that with consumers and manage that transition to a different set of arrangements? Because if you're changing what they expect, and you won't see you need to check this cumulative reading on your 2 bills, I think there's a piece we'll need to understand there, how we make this work for consumers in that transition to a new way of operating these processes.
It's for those. I mean, do we show the cumulative on bills? I mean, again, we're talking about traditional where there isn't actually a cumulative, a total cumulative register on the meter. So it's having that communication with the customer. Because again, from a customer's perspective, they're just looking at what's physically on the meter, what they can see. That they're going to be oblivious to in a traditional world to a total cumulative register.
Yeah. Okay, that's been really helpful from my perspective. I guess where we've got to is it sounds like in all scenarios the customer should be able to dispute the meter register reading as well as the cumulative. I guess when we get down to the actual drafting, there might be scenarios where we want to draw out to avoid just getting lots of additional disputes that we don't need. We might have to call out specific scenarios where there would be sort of restrictions on the raising of disputes. But that's been really helpful to get to the next point. I think one of the key things that's come out for me is that we've got the question on the next slide actually, but whether we need to have different processes for smart and traditional. And I think from the sounds of it, we probably will have different processes, or at least information required within those to support those processes, and potentially different triggers as well. So we can pick that back up again. Keen now, if we just look at the slide that we've got on the screen, which is really about the overall scope, and one of the questions that we had was around the current process being only mandated for non-half hourly. Obviously we're moving away from definitions of half hourly and non-half hourly, so we've got the different market segments, and and we've obviously talked about smart and traditional meters, which fall under the smart market segment, and the disputes that are likely to come up with those. I think what we wanted to understand going forward was whether there should be any restrictions applied to this process, whether there's areas of the market that either wouldn't need to use the process or shouldn't need to follow the process. So I guess one of the questions we had was around the advanced market segment. So the MHHS process set out doesn't have that reference across into the D300 switch meter reading exception process, and I think there was a kind of assumption that there wouldn't the process wouldn't be needed within the advanced market segment. So I guess we were keen to get views on whether the process should be limited to just the smart market segment, or whether it was applicable. Whether you can see any scenarios where it could be applicable within the advanced market segment? Has anyone got any thoughts on that? Yeah, Hashada.
Could we list down what are those set of restrictions which we are talking about?
So it's just the way the REC is drafted at the moment, and it's taken from the MRA as was, that the process for disputing and raising issues with missing switch reads that needs to be followed, that's set out within the REC. That requirement is limited currently. It's limited to non-half hourly metering systems, so it's mandated for non-half hourly, but it's not required for half hourly. So that's really the question going forwards, where there is no differentiation between non-half hourly and half hourly. Does that follow that the process is we just remove the reference to non-half hourly and leave the process there for everything, or is there should we only be using this process for the smart market segment? Paul, I see your hand's gone up.
I can't see why you exclude advanced meters, because I would expect a number of customers to still be build and have readings and operate in quite a normally similar way. So I presume the consequence of that is effectively you're saying, or is it you basically saying advanced meters only ever, or the customer can't dispute it, or that data can never be changed, or customers only get billed to the half hourly data rather than register reads? There's some consequence, and I don't think any of those things are true, so I can't see why you wouldn't extend it to advanced meters as well.
But yeah, probably I'll come to you in a minute, Stephen. I was just going to say, I think historically, when this process transferred to the REC, there was a conversation about extending just removing the restriction, and I think it was just something that wasn't done for switching, because it wasn't deemed to be a direct result of the switching processes. So I don't think that I'm not aware of any particular arguments more recently why the process is restricted, so that's useful. Stephen, did you want to add?
Yeah, really just agree with what Paul said there, Sarah. Really, we've got obviously a number of advanced meters just now that are settled on an MHHS basis. So if we actually put in a market restriction just now, we'd be taking those customers that we can currently follow that disputes process for, we'd be taking them out of the process, and we'd be I think it'd be a backward step to do that.
Yeah.
Can I just ask everyone here, does some of this depend on the outcome of the current BSC modifications that are seeking to mandate half-hourly settlement for these particular meter types? So, there's some open BSC modifications right now, aren't there? That are seeking to, one is seeking to mandate half-hourly settlement for all CT metering, and one for all advanced whole current metering separately. And if those two go ahead, is there an assumption that all of those advanced meters will be subject to the current half-hourly settlement process and therefore out of scope of this completely. So is there a dependency on the outcome of those mods that ultimately determines this?
I don't know if there is a dependency on that, Jonathan, because the migration of those meters to the a half-hourly model could span the MHHS go live date, so they might actually be getting migrated into the MHHS model rather than the current half-hourly settlement model. So I don't think that would necessarily really exclude them from this process, from the disputes process.
And that would be on the basis that, so is that just the basis of when they move to that half-hourly arrangement? So once they've moved, there would be this process wouldn't be relevant to them, but there's a possibility. Are you saying there's a possibility they could move after this new process comes in, so there's an overlap?
Yeah, potentially. Yep.
Okay, so the implementation approach and arrangements for that, if they're approved as well, I suppose there is a dependency there, but it's also dependent not just on a binary choice of if it's approved or not. It's also dependent on the implementation date and approach.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yep.
Okay, thanks. Paul.
And I guess the other question I just possibly still forming things to my mind is, and that makes this again, that's settlements and billing. So the reason it's not half hourly at the moment because it's only using half hourly data. I guess one of the question would requiring all those sites to be settled necessarily. I mean, and possibly it is the nature of the current processes mean that they have to be billed to that data as well because that's all that's available. Because what we'll talk about in the future is that we're talking about disputing switch meter reads, which may be something that's slightly or not quite the same thing that's going through the settlement process. Could that also be the case for those customers, depending on whether moving them all to be billed only on half-hourly data is necessarily appropriate?
Yeah, and I think there's wider considerations needed there, aren't there? There's the I think there's some wider considerations there that have been discussed under the programme, because there's been a recent decision now that for the non-half-hourly advanced meters that exist today, they would all no longer use a D313 and will move over to using a D268 in the new world. And I think that was based on the assumption that they would be using that half-hourly settlement data and therefore wouldn't need to identify billing registers. I think the view was that if the supplier chose to use registers for that, then they would use that would be through a kind of bilateral arrangement with their AMR service provider, but to go and retrieve register data if that's configured on the meter, but that everything flowing through industry for the purposes of settlement would be based on settlement period level consumption data, and that's what would flow through. But I think you mentioned, Paul, that there are potentially still some things that need to be clarified about exactly how that should work. But I think my interpretation of the recent programme decision on de-scoping the D313 and depending on the outcome of this BSC modification would be that all of those metering points should be operating on the same basis as half-hourly metering points today.
I can understand why the case. This is a debate for those mods as well, what that means for customers and how they get billed, and tariffs, and that's part of the debate around the implementation of those mods, I guess. Because the good thing about market-wide high-value settlement is that at least it doesn't require one of the bad things is it separates billing and settlement. One of the good things is it separates billing and settlement in that it allows you to still continue, as we will for a lot of our domestic customers, going to register reads, even though you're settling them half hourly, how that might work. Because I think there was an argument as well for including SSCs for the AM advanced meter segment as well, but as it sounds like a decision's been made about having the 268 and not maintaining that information for advanced meters.
Yeah, I think the most recent, I mean, I think it's still got to be ratified by the design advisory group, but I think the view that was going up was that it wouldn't use that. But I agree. I think there's still stuff there's still stuff to be considered in what that means for this enduring mod and all of that. But I think in relation to the question about is the decision here dependent on all of that stuff, I think what I'm getting is that is that in the event that the policy decision that comes out of that modification and the MHHS design decision kind of say that all of these customers must and shall be treated as half-hourly customers for the purposes of settlement and including on a switch. And I think that answers it for the purposes of this process, that they would be out of scope. I think there is that point of if there are use cases where there are customers in the advanced segment that still require the exchange of meter readings, then that's where there could be that's where I think we would need to revisit this and consider if we need to allow for a dispute or a missing process for advanced as well.
And I guess if we did need to allow for it, would it be different to the traditional process? Because I think there's two slightly different questions here. At the moment, the process is only mandated for non-half hourly. That's slightly different to, do we define a process that's used for advanced? And I guess if the process would be the same, like when we get to the difference between the smart and traditional, actually for traditional meters there's a slightly different process. Can that apply to advanced, and we just don't need to reference that distinction at all in the sort of scope of the process piece? Or is the process for advanced, would it be completely different to that you'd use for traditional?
I'm guessing Sarah mainly uses going to use just half-hourly data, so you don't have. I think that involves cumulative reads. I think it gets estimated at. So I'm not sure it has register reads in that model at all. In which case, I'm not sure what would happen. It's the trigger for someone to go, I'm not, or to identify an inaccuracy in the way that the data has been allocated around the switch event, and that needs to be changed. And I'm sure it may be quite unlikely, and it may be more principles based than because then it's how do you adjust that data. I think it's kind of better. I'm trying to think of how that problem could occur in the first place. And we need to come up with a complex process, or just, I know, for example, for things like ETs, so how they stuff at the moment, it's more on a bilateral, agreed basis, because they are very few and far between, and it's easier to do something, an accommodation that way, than to have a specified process. But I'm not really sure how you would, what someone would dispute and how you would amend it as a result of that dispute actually in the settlements process at a half-hourly data. So what we talked about is changing the cumulative and that changing the half-hourly data as a consequence. What that would mean for in advance, where all we've got is the half-hourly data, how you'd adjust that data as a result of a dispute. I'm not sure how that process itself would work.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, it sounds like we probably won't need to define a process for advanced, but we might need to be aware that there is potential that these things could occur, and that they'd have to be dealt with bilaterally, as you say. So, but I think that's, if people are sort of not got anything to sort of disagree on that, then that's a kind of assumption we can state, and then sort of see if anybody comes back to challenge challenge that position. Okay, that's useful. If we can move on to the next slide, I think we have had a few questions that we wanted to work through, and I think we've kind of been working through them. So so hopefully we can sort of summarise where we've got to. So the first question there is obviously the one that we spent quite a bit of time talking about, and I think we've got to the position where we definitely can see the need for a process for disputing cumulative reads and for raising exceptions where there's missing reads. I think from the discussion that we've had, I get the impression there's still a view that we do need to be able to dispute meter register readings, certainly in traditional. I think we need to understand that a bit more in terms of the SMART process. But I guess what that means for the REC is that the process that we've got at the moment talks about switch meter read exceptions. I think we'll have to break that down and define what we mean by switch meter read, and within that process we'll have to break down what's being shared across the different steps of the process. I think it's a general point for the REC that this concept of cumulative read is going to need to be reflected within the REC drafting on the electricity side to distinguish between the two different types of reads. In terms of the other questions, so I guess one of the things that we're going to need to do is understand the existing restrictions and the sort of triggers for the process. So I guess in terms of the timescales, one of the things we wanted to talk about was the existing timescale is in the schedule around raising disputed reads within 12 months. One of the things that the MHHS programme is doing is looking to reduce the settlement timetable with RF at 4 months. And whilst it's not doesn't directly mean that we need to amend the read process within the REC, or the disputes process within the REC, I think it's one that we need to at least consider on whether the timescale for raising disputed reads should be pulled in to a shorter period. So any reflection of the outcome into settlements is captured pre-RF rather than needing to go through a trading dispute. Any thoughts on that specifically? So this is specifically on the disputed read. I think the missing reads we can come to afterwards, but keen to understand people's views if there was a shortening of that timescale, particularly the consumer impact of that, given that it's consumers that are likely to raise these disputes.
I was just going to come on to that, Sarah, whether or not now is the one that if it's supplier initiated, it's within the 4 months. However, does it need to be extended if it's customer initiated rather than just having a one size fits all? Is that a consideration?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we can specify what we need to within the REC. I think it's then a consideration of what happens from a settlement perspective if it's later than 4 months, and there's not that's kind of not really a REC consideration. Well, like the end of the REC process is suppliers send the agreed reads back to the data services or data collectors as it is currently, for it to be reflected in settlement. And I think that's the thing from a supplier point of view. If it was after the RF, then you guys would need to raise disputes in to get that reflected. Paul, I see your hand's gone up.
I think it's exactly as you put up before. You mentioned that point is what we're basically saying is if we reduce it to 4 months is not great for consumers, because it means that it takes that cut off, and I don't know what the age profile and again how some of the other processes might change that age profile. But it's we basically going to say if it's restricting it for consumers is not great, but not doing that means that you are effectively creating this, you're not going to reflect that into settlements, and everybody has to collectively say, yeah, we accept that, and hope, it depends what the impact of that is, and whether it's kind of an evenly distributed or any suppliers. I think this is, because we talk about the settlement terms of 4 months, is one of the things that how achievable it is, or how do we drive, what are the other things we can do around encouraging people to check their bills, raise a dispute, do other things that go around this to drive towards that, because otherwise what you're going to have is either a mismatch between billing and settlements, which isn't great and is worse than today's situation, or you end up, I don't think you would reach a materiality threshold for disputes, but then it's that it's a behaviour change that helps drive us towards being able to, what can we do to achieve 4 months, or do we effectively collectively accept that we're going to have this disconnect between billing and settlements in these instances, but the number of disputes should go down because of the process. I think of the questions, I'm not sure we know the answers at this point, because we don't know how these processes are really going to operate in practice. And that's always my concern with the 4 months, is we're going to go to 4 months quite quickly without how quickly that is, and how we've tested that all these things are achievable within that period. To the benefit, settlement will work. Will this still continue to work for the consumer experience? I think is the question we need to work out how we can make that work for consumers as well.
Yeah, and I don't think you could say disputes need to be disputed switch reads need to be raised within 4 months, because you've got to still go through the process, haven't you? So you need to go through the process and have it resolved and have an agreed switch read at the point that RF occurs at 4 months. So so you'd be cutting it very short from a customer perspective. But I think the suggestion that that if they're supplier initiated disputes earlier, that could be a useful sort of requirement to put into the RECCo. I think one of the things that we've talked about previously is that currently the BSE kind of implies, whether it's explicit or not, I'm not sure, that you use the same use the same reads for settlement as you do for billing. Obviously that's going away with the MHHS. So maybe if you put a requirement around that reconciliation process, so that suppliers do have that requirement to look at the information that comes across from the old supplier and use the most appropriate data for billing to try and mitigate the customer coming back at a later date with a dispute. Maybe that partially sort of mitigates the risk that we're talking about, without actually without a clear stop on suppliers, on customers raising these things. Does that make sense? Would that be useful?
So is what we're saying there, Sarah, that is what we're saying there, that there's a kind of inevitability here that under the new process, once we switch over to the new settlement to the new settlement timetable, that if this is raised after 4 months, you won't be able to amend it from the cause date, because some of that will be crystallized.
Yeah.
But if so, there's a kind of natural incentive on suppliers to identify and resolve these issues where possible within that 4-month period. However, if a customer has raised an issue with their billing that is linked to the COS reading, that new RF window shouldn't prevent the supplier from resolving the billing issue for the customer and ensuring they're being billed accurately.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the starting point, and I think that'd be good to sort of get views on that. I think my question was one further, is you said there's a natural incentive on suppliers to identify these things and resolve them early, and it's whether there needs to be an additional regulatory requirement in there to sort of support that. But we can come back to that one. I think going back to your original point, it would be useful just to understand people's views, if that makes sense. What John was suggesting there, we can't stop customers raising these things, but there's an acknowledgement that if it goes past the RF, that it won't necessarily get reflected in settlements. Rashada, did you have a view?
Yeah. And so what I understand, because of smart meter, we can always get the half-hourly reads, and when there is a switch on a supply start date, my understanding is at midnight we get we will have a read. So that's positive scenario, that smart meter is still reading and having got not issue. There is a exception scenario that particular day on the switch, smart meter hasn't read anything, and that kind of comes down to creating the estimate, and that estimate read is what could cause a dispute, because if it is not an estimated read, if it is a real read, there is no reason for dispute, because that's direct read. Come to the non-smart meters as traditional meters. Though it is not a kind of a rule, but then if customer provides their last read, definitely it won't be midnight read. Probably it is that they should be happy with that. Okay, we provided this read, so previous customer, the old customer will bill up to that read, and the new customer will start billing from that read. Is that something not kind of a settled process between the customer and the supplier? Because here what we are more considering is how we can not upset the customer and still continue doing the market and half hourly billing. The market and half hourly will move on to the cumulative rates, but this is traditional meter, they'll still continue with providing the reads through the meters.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the customer read process still retained as is, and those reads are shared between suppliers, and Happy Path suppliers will agree those and both bill off that customer read that either of the suppliers have obtained. I guess there's still always a risk that the suppliers won't agree those the customer read and the process is there. But yeah, I think we're agreed in that position. That and I think that really comes back to something Paul said earlier, that the new processes, we should see reduction in kind of the concerns around the switch meter readings, because the processes are there. The smart reads should be obtained, and the customer reads, but there's always going to be scenarios where the reads are missing and the process isn't followed through the Happy Path. So yeah, I think that is the position we're in, and I guess is your point that therefore the process, it shouldn't take 12 months for someone to identify an issue, and therefore shortening the timescale shouldn't be a significant concern?
Yeah, ideally, because here what we are kind of looking at all customers, not necessarily just domestic, where there could be considerations with non-domestic customer where the position of the meter is in such a place that no one can provide, or maybe people are not working on that day because it is a commercial meter, so they cannot provide you the last reading. Those are the exceptional scenarios. And that will there be a issue raised on the exceptions on the meter readings by the non-domestic customers? So it depends where we are focusing on. Now, if we're focusing on the domestic customer more, then in that case, the domestic customer can provide. Majority of the domestic customers meters, they can read out their current readings from where they are. If it is non-smart meter, if we are focusing on the dispute reads or missing reads from the non-domestic customer point of view, then probably that will become still an issue if the the customer as a non-domestic customer is not happy to accept the read and the billing issues. And this is where, if we are focusing on that, then probably that's a slightly different scenario. So we kind of mixing all scenarios in one place. If we separate them out, probably we may get a more clearer view that what problem we want to solve here.
Okay, I think that's useful, and we probably ought to come back to that domestic versus non-domestic point. Paul, did you want to raise your point now, or we
yes, I think you just you covered a lot of it. I think it's hard to know how some of these processes are going to work, and new estimation and new ways of what that might mean for the number of disputes that get raised. I think that's part of Ashai's question as well. I think it's hard to know exactly how it's going to happen. What I do think is a concern is if you mandate that suppliers do something in terms of compensating the customer or doing that they can't recover through settlement, and I think that need to be clear on or understanding the impact of that, because you're basically saying is you might need to give the customer back some money, but you having due to that disputed read, adjusting the final bill, but you can't adjust settlement, so you're still liable for that energy in settlement. And it's a similar argument I think we've had around, I think, ETs. Is you're basically saying you're not billing for that energy, but you are paying for it, and you can't do anything about it. And that would be if you're going to place that obligation on suppliers to do something that they can't then recover, I think there needs to be an understanding of what the cost of that is, because it sounds like a good outcome for customers, but ultimately that starts to create a disconnect, and how those costs get recovered if we're not recovering from the people who use that energy. So I think these are the things I expect us to look at and to understand as we go through the transition before we move to the 4 months. So you're going to have I presume, quite a long period between people migrating to micro half hourly settlement, and I think the settlement calendar moves to 4 months after the end of transition. I think these are the kind of things we need to monitor in that period to say how are disputes getting raised, are they going up or going down, and what does it mean if we were to move that to 4 months? What could be the potential materiality if we keep the disputes threshold or timescale in the RECCo at 12 instead?
So sorry, but I didn't. I was trying to understand that a bit more. So are you saying that because the 4 month settlement window is happening, and ultimately that would affect when readings can be changed with the data service or not, right? Yeah. So are you saying that we leave the timescale in the REC as 12 months and rates and just leave people to work around what that means, or are you saying we look to reduce the time scale in the REC and consider if that needs to change again in the future? I didn't quite follow that, sorry.
So I think my point would be, I think we should work out how we can make that timescale work at 4 months, because otherwise you are requiring suppliers to not have a mismatch between billing and settlement, and that is not an ideal position. So I would, without disadvantaging customers or creating an unnecessary cut-off, how we can bring that timescale to be in line with the settlement calendar would be something would be my preferred outcome.
Right. So trying to make sure that the process is completed reasonably within the 4 months when we cut over to the new settlement calendar. What I don't think we can do in the REC is kind of put in a hard cut-off for correcting the billing, because ultimately I think that's more to do with compliance with the license than the REC. I think anything we put in the REC around, correcting customer billing after after the settlement window closed, I think that would just essentially be something that would be complementary to the license reflected in that particular process. So essentially making sure that the customer is being billed accurately and treated fairly as a kind of principle of the process, regardless of the impacts of the settlement window.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the point around aiming to get an end-to-end process in that works within that new settlement window does seem like a like the right objective for how we take it forward, though.
It'd be useful to understand the timescales on currently the raising of these types of disputes as well. I don't know if that's something we've got internally within the RECCo, or if we need to get information from suppliers, but whether how many of these are raised currently outside of the 3 or 4 month window. I'll have to go away and see if we've got that information through the performance assurance arm. Okay, so can we just come back to the point that Harshada was making around the domestic versus non-domestic? I guess we didn't touch on that when we were talking about the scope of the process. We were talking about the sort of different market segments. I guess I just assumed that the process would be applicable across the board and not restricted just to domestics. Is there any reason why we would need a different process for domestic and non-domestic, or whether the process would just apply across the board based on the market segment?
Well, I would say the process should apply across the board, but like the scenarios would differ based on where the complaints are coming from.
And what would be the impact of that, though? Is it materiality and timescales, or anything like more insight in terms of the actual process itself? I guess I'm assuming the process would be the same, but it might be that that there potentially the triggers might have different timescales or materiality associated with them.
Yeah, because what my consideration is, like for domestic, the raising the missing or dispute between 10 to 17 days is quite short, because they won't know until they get the next bill. And for non-domestic, probably some may not even realize, because there'll be a company making the normal payment, and suddenly if it is shooted high, that would be it differs. But yeah, within that, your second last point, within 10 to 17 working day time scale for raising, that may not be appropriate between either case. Whether 12 months time scale is raising the dispute is okay, then the 4 months, that, as Paul said, we can target towards the new requirement of 4 months and see how we can fit within that. Yeah, I won't say like we change the process separate for non-domestic and domestic, but what is more realistic, and yeah, what will apply what you said last, based on the statistics behind how many disputes that we have received, which is beyond 12 months or beyond 4 months, and that kind of gives us a better view, like is achievable within the 4 months, because if the percentage is very low, then yeah, we can just squeeze those low percentages. If percentage is very high, then yes, we can dispute like 4 months is not enough.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, yeah, we'll see if we've got any information that can support that kind of consideration. So I guess moving on to the next question, which you mentioned, the raising missing read. So currently we've got the 10 to 17 days. I guess looking at the new process that MHHS have brought out, the sharing of information, the sharing the cumulative or the estimated, it's certainly on the smart side. There's an expectation that will be done within 5 working days, again linked to the reduction in the settlement calendar. The focus is on trying to get the information within the timescale for the initial settlement run. So and with that being shorter, these timescales have been set out with that in mind. So so the expectation is that if actual reads aren't on smart, if actual reads aren't aren't recoverable from the meter, then the cumulative the estimate will be sent within 5 days. So I guess the question was whether there's scope to reduce that that timeline that's on the within the schedule currently. I was just looking at the process actually, and for traditional as well, the expectation is that the data service will estimate the reads as well for traditional meters at 5 days following the change of supply, so and send the D10s. So the expectation from the MHHS processes is that within 5 days these switch reads will be shared with the various actors. So I know we've gone from talking about 12 months and 4 months to talking about a matter of days, but do you think there's scope to reduce those timescales that are currently set out off the back of the changes that MHHS are introducing, and at least to align them and remove the need for having two separate timescales there?
Sorry, sir. Why have we got the 2 separate timescales?
Funny, I was just going to check. So the 10 days is for currently it's worded as the DCC enrolled, and then 15 is for 17 is for the non-DCC enrolled. So interpreting that as the difference between smart and traditional, as we're now referring to them.
Sarah, is it worth considering a phased approach here? So leave them as is for a period of time, and then maybe once the full migration is completed, review?
It's a really good point, actually, in terms of migration as well, and how we would apply any of these changes through the period of migration. I think some of the things we're considering of, do you bring the stuff in at the beginning? Do you bring it at the end? Do you bring it in relation to the specific metering points? And I guess in this area, it doesn't necessarily feel like something that you need to make. No, maybe you do need to make some changes as based on the metering point itself and whether it's been migrated. But yeah, I think that's definitely a consideration to bear in mind. I guess in all of this, it's if you shaved off 5 days from these timescales, then you're supporting that argument of trying to get everything resolved by RF. So whilst it doesn't look like it would be, it would really help very much to reduce those timescales, it will give everybody a bit more time to actually resolve the issues within the RF window. But
the key question here, again, not that fussed about settlement. I'd like to issue a final bill to a customer, so that's what needs to drive it towards us getting this resolved more quickly. In the current timescales, you say vary by smart, and effectively it's long enough for it to complete, and then a few days on top of that to sort out any, try and address the exceptions why it didn't work as business as usual. So smart should be at 5 days plus 1, I think, and then 4 days to sort out the exceptions, and it's something nominally similar, I think, to the 17 working days. Is effectively at what point is this not going? It's not just a problem; it's just not going to work, and we need to do something else. And again, it's reflecting what customer expectations might be. So it's that how long should it take? I think you mentioned 5 working days. So it sounds like, and what's the exceptions process? How can you get those things fixed? At what point can you say we should start this because the business usual process isn't going to work, and that's how we came to the current timescales? And it sounds like a similar set of logic. And Keith's absolutely right. It's whether we can leave it where it is and monitor and do that, or whether we need to have, as part of that transition, something that's a bit more fit for purpose. But I mean, I could see both of those coming toward, if the standard process is 5 working days, aligning to 10 wouldn't seem, wouldn't seem unreasonable to do. I think the 17 seems like quite a long time for the process. That's based on currently you wouldn't try and deem a reading until I think it's SSD plus 8 working days. So that's where those timescales come from.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Any other thoughts on that? Because that could be a neat solution. And take the point that, you know, could you leave it to the end of migration? But it would be harder to make a change, an MHHS change at the end if we've kind of already got metering points sort of migrated and working to these longer timescales. So making a change earlier would be helpful. But if we if there was a suggestion that the timescales were combined rather than having two different ones, so there was just a 10 working day timescale for raising a missing read, do you think that does anyone would anyone have concerns with that proposal on initial consideration? Do you think it's a fair suggestion as something we could take forward for further consideration?
Any reasoning behind why just 10 days?
I think it's what Paul was just suggesting. So the timescales for getting the reads for sharing the reads are 5 days. So the 10 days was to give that bit of time for the suppliers to work out that they haven't received the reads and try and resolve through internal processes before actually needing to raise a sort of formal dispute through the D300 process. Does that make sense? Stephen, did you want to add something?
Yeah, Sarah. So sorry, I'm not, you know, strictly opposed to that. It's just we need to be aware that obviously it does mean that the longer it takes to exchange these reads or retrieve those reads, it means that the new smart data service will be submitting, you know, data to settlements. You know, so the longer we leave it, the more data I would guess that will probably be submitted based on load shapes by the new smart data service, and which means that when they get a read, when a read is eventually provided, it might mean that they need to there's more data that needs to be corrected. No, the smart data service will need to perhaps undo some of those settlement periods that they've submitted into the central systems.
So just clear on that. So there's a requirement under the MHHS for the reads to be provided within 5 days, but is the suggestion that if you waited a bit longer, there might be more accurate ones in scenarios where estimation's being used?
Not necessarily wait a bit longer. It's just if we're sort of misaligned, if this timescale is misaligned with the MHHS timescale, because that is there really is really the marker for when the new smart data service is going to have to start providing information to settlements.
So which timescale are you suggesting that we should align to?
Well, ideally, you know, working to different timescales doesn't seem to be the best approach. You know, ideally, you'd be looking to work towards the same timescales as MHHS, but recognising the challenges that Paul has outlined. You know, and in the majority of cases, it should be fine, but there'll be some where you've got exceptions and you need to try and resolve those internally. But it is, if we're going to set a timescale that is longer than that MHHS timescale, we just need to be aware that it does mean that the new smart data service will be submitting data that might be inaccurate, that might need to be corrected once the read is provided.
Okay. I'm not sure if I'm following the point, Stephen.
So that smart data service, if the information isn't available, if the starting information isn't available, the start read for that customer.
Yeah.
isn't available, and that smart data service can't access the half-hourly information for whatever reason, then they've got nothing to base their the half-hourly intervals on. You know, so they don't really have a starting point that they can base those half-hourly intervals on. So most of those half-hourly intervals, I guess, will be submitted based on the load shapes.
So I guess these timescales, this isn't saying you have to wait for this length of time before you can raise a dispute. You can raise the dispute earlier. So if this is the maximum timescale, if there's a missing read, you need to raise it within 10/17 working days. So I guess if your process is set up that you can identify that it's missing and raise it after the sort of 6 or 7 days, then you can do that.
Okay, so that's not really within. So that's not really the time scale for the losing supplier. Essentially, that's for the new supplier to raise that. So we've got 10 days to raise that missing read request.
So the losing supplier also has a time scale. That's 15 working days. So it was between the two. Paul, were you going to disagree with me?
Yeah, only I'm going to, yes, sorry, Sarah. You do need to wait that long, so it's not by that time. It's you shouldn't raise it. I happened to be looking at this part of the RECCo yesterday, coincidentally. You shouldn't raise it before that time, because that's the time. Yeah, what we shouldn't be doing is raising a missing reading until it's clear that the process to generate one isn't going to work, and that's what drives the timescale. So if you start raising missing reads really early, the problem you've got is it might be before the process has completed. So that's what the RECCo currently says, is you can't raise it before 10 working days or 17 working days or 15 working days. So yeah, it's in that bit. I think it's what currently, and this is where you get it's hard to picture exactly how this will work in the future. We know what currently drives missing reads is the failure of transfer of data between data collectors and one of both suppliers not getting the D86. That would you see the same problems in the same manner? You're changing the underlying process. What does that mean for missing reads in terms of it? Will they still occur? So Stephen's point of view is what would happen if and I'm not sure, I can't remember what's in the process, if the new data service hasn't received the data and it can't, hasn't been transferred from the previous the previous service. What happens in those circumstances? What's the resolution process? What would they settle on in terms of load shapes? Or is it possible that they've gotten a reading but it just hasn't made it to the suppliers for some reason? There are lots of scenarios in here that could have different impacts. I think that comes back to those timescales. Is what is the process for getting that new data service, generating those readings? How could it go wrong? How do those things get fixed? And at what point do you say we need to step in now? It doesn't necessarily fix it for settlement. And the whole point of the missing reads process is say we need to get the customer, especially from their closing bill, billed, and we need to start that process now because something's gone wrong in settlement. And it's hard to project forward what are those issues going to be and how many times is it going to go wrong, which causes either or both suppliers to go, right, I don't have a reading to open close my billing to, I need to initiate this process. And it's a supplier initiated process. It may not, take Stephen's point, it may be that the data service has done it, it's just that the supplier hasn't received it for some reason, that's why they initiate it. So I think those are the things to consider in this. Yeah, it's not an answer. It's just lots of those.
No, I think that's useful. I've just reread. Yeah, I've just reread it and read it in a completely different way. Based on that. So yeah, that makes sense. But what it does mean is there is currently no restriction on the maximum time within which you can raise a missing read exception. So I think that's another area to capture and think about. Conscious of time, I think we've touched on all of the questions we wanted to discuss today. I'm not sure we have have any clear answers on some of those questions. I think we need to take it away and think through some of the examples. I think on the last bullet on the slides we had the question around the need for separate processes. I think we probably do, or at least separate triggers to be set out. I think we'll need to take this away and sort of have some conversations about how we can sort of take what the next steps are really in terms of working out the process that we need for MHHS, because I think some of the things that we've talked about today are not completely linked to MHHS. Some of the points around settlement calendar as well, which isn't necessarily coming in at the start of MHHS. So I think we'll need to have a think about next steps on this, and certainly looking at some more examples and getting down to the next level of detail. But that's been really useful. John, is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, other than just again, thank you everyone for your time and your contribution. It's been really useful. We'll take it away and we'll publish an update on the next steps and how we look to bring this forwards.
Yeah, and I guess just in terms of timescales, just the draft in our MHHS drafting kicks off in earnest in January, and it's for those that aren't familiar with the plan, there are tranches of drafting. The first tranche we're looking at is metering under the RECCo and the changes that we need to make to the metering op schedule, and then the next step is registration, and that's where we've sort of pinpointed the changes that we need to make for this process. So we've got some time to think through it before we get to the point of actually talking to you guys and consulting on actual drafting. So yeah, we'll be looking at this, and we'll come back into it in the new year. Paul, is that a new hand, or was that a legacy hand, Paul? We've lost you, Paul.
Legacy hand. I'm really sorry.
No worries. Any final questions from anybody on the call? I don't know if anything came up in Slido.
No, we've not had anything further come through on Slido. So unless anyone has any final questions, I think we can wrap up.
Okay. If anyone has any thoughts post meeting, please feel free to drop us an email. Any thoughts and scenarios that we need to consider will be gratefully received.
Yeah,
brilliant.
And yeah, so just final one from me. Thank you to everyone for participating in today's event. I've set up a survey on Slido. We would greatly appreciate any feedback that you may have on today's event. So please feel free to submit any feedback, and this will be really useful for us for future events. So thank you again. Have a good day.
Thanks.